Thanks very much, Bobby, and thanks especially to Joe for the invitation to speak to you at this year's MacGill Summer School. So, Brexit constitutes one of the biggest challenges currently facing Ireland. While there is much uncertainty, both political and economic, around the final phase of Brexit, we do know that Ireland is particularly exposed to Brexit and that any type of Brexit will have negative and potentially far-reaching impacts for the economy. In order to get a more complete picture of the likely economic impact of Brexit, we need to examine both macroeconomic analysis, which gives an indication of how key economic indicators like GDP or employment could be impacted, together with more microeconomic evidence, which will tell us if certain sectors, particular regions, different types of firms, or different types of households could be disproportionately impacted by Brexit. So today, more than 3 years after the UK referendum on EU membership, we're still unsure about what form Brexit will take. There is a whole spectrum of outcomes of varying degrees of economic cooperation possible between the UK and EU outside of membership. The first step to negotiate withdrawal is still ongoing, but there are a huge range of issues to be negotiated after exit as well. While a withdrawal agreement and political declaration were agreed between the UK and EU government and the EU in November 2018, the UK House of Commons has failed to pass it, or parts of it, on at least 3 occasions. So while on one level it seems that an awful lot has changed since last November, actually very little of substance has changed. Despite the change in the exit date with the extension to the 31st of October, and Theresa May's resignation as leader of the Conservative Party, the UK and EU negotiation positions have changed very little over the last year. The current political impasse in the UK means that there are a whole range of future possibilities for the Brexit process, including a further extension to Article 50, another meaningful vote in the UK Parliament, a general election in the UK, a confirmatory referendum in the UK getting some additional concession from the EU, or the UK even deciding to leave the EU without a deal. This non-exhaustive list of possibilities could ultimately result in some sort of a very soft Brexit, which would have relatively more limited economic impacts, a more extreme hard Brexit, where trade between the EU and UK would be conducted under the World Trade Organization tariff regimes, or even the UK deciding to revoke Article 50. So these are very uncertain times, and while I would be reluctant to attach probabilities to any of these events, the risk of a hard or no-deal Brexit is now considerably heightened, as there appears to have been a hardening in the UK government stance on Brexit, and the exit date is drawing ever closer. So there's also uncertainty as to the economic impact of Brexit, in whatever form it eventually takes, as there's no precedent of a country leaving a major and deeply integrated bloc like the EU. So looking first at the UK, its substantial interlinkages with the European economy and the wider international economy suggest that the impact of Brexit could be considerable. In fact, Deputy Chambers has already pointed out that the UK is already being impacted by the decision to leave the EU in terms of the impact on social cohesion. Well, there's also some evidence to suggest that the performance of the economy, of the UK economy, has already been impacted by the decision to leave the EU, with overall growth in the UK already having apparently fallen below where it otherwise would have been since the referendum. And this is largely attributed to the impact of uncertainty where businesses are delaying investment decisions. The overwhelming majority of evidence from the Treasury, the Bank of England, international organisations like the IMF and the OECD, UK research institutes and the wider academic community suggests that Brexit will reduce economic activity in the UK substantially below where it otherwise would have been. Many of these studies consider a range of channels through which Brexit could impact the UK economy, such as reduced trade, FDI, UK budget contributions to the EU, migration and reduced productivity because of lower trade and lower FDI. Looking across all of these studies, the average long-run impact, broadly speaking, the impact after 10 years, amounts to around a 6% loss to UK GDP in the event of a no-deal scenario, and around a 3.5% loss to UK GDP in the event of a free trade agreement type scenario. While all of these studies indicate that in the long run, the UK will be smaller outside of the EU, so smaller in terms of GDP, they do not necessarily imply a contraction in activity or a recession, rather that the level of output will be lower than if the UK were to stay in the EU. In other words, the UK economy may continue to grow over the longer run, but more slowly than as an EU member. The short-term impacts of Brexit are more difficult to quantify than the longer-term impacts, as they're driven by additional factors, including uncertainty and exchange rate fluctuations. They also crucially depend on whether a deal is agreed between the UK and EU that includes a transition period, during which time the UK would continue to abide by all existing EU rules and regulations, so not much would change immediately. Or the worst case scenario where the UK leaves the EU without a deal. Turning now to Ireland, a consistent finding in the international literature is that after the UK, Ireland is the EU member state that is most exposed to Brexit. This is not least because Ireland is one of the most open economies in the world, so we're more vulnerable to external shocks in general, but also because the UK is one of our closest economic partners. One of the key economic linkages between Ireland and the UK is in terms of trade. Around 14% of our goods exports and 20% of our services exports are to the UK. And imports from the UK are also significant. Around 26% of goods imports and 10% of services imports are from the UK. So any increase in barriers to trade in terms of direct tariffs charged on goods or any of a range of possible non-tariff measures, which include technical requirements such as licensing, labelling standards, health and veterinary rules on food or animal products, or any administration requirements such as documentation, customs inspections, and so on, that add to the costs of trade or can lead to delays in trade, could all lead to very significant disruptions in trade. So while the EU as a single country is our most important trading partner, we export and import more with the EU as a whole. But another key aspect to this is that a considerable volume of Irish goods are shipped to and from the continent via the UK land bridge. Thus, any increases in barriers to trade could result in delays for goods that transit through the UK to and from Ireland and the EU. So overall, these trade linkages point to how disruptions in trading patterns are likely to have a significant negative impact on Ireland. Since before the referendum result, a significant body of research has sought to estimate the potential consequences of Brexit for the Irish economy. At a more macroeconomic level, there have been various studies by my own institute, the ESRI, but also by the Central Bank, the OECD, the IMF, and Copenhagen Economics. While there are some differences in assumptions across all of these studies, they all use broadly the same approach, and a consistent finding across all of them is that the macroeconomic effect of Brexit is negative and significant for Ireland. To deal with the uncertainty around the eventual agreement between the UK and EU, most studies consider a number of scenarios that cover the range of possible outcomes and compare them to a situation or to a scenario where the UK stays in the EU. So more recently, analysis is focused on what we commonly refer to as deal and no deal scenarios. So generally speaking, deal scenarios are based on the withdrawal agreement, and they're consistent with a high degree of alignment between the UK and EU in the future. This involves the UK making an orderly agreed exit from the EU, a transition period to the end of 2020, and a free trade agreement being in place between the UK and EU thereafter. In no-deal scenarios, the UK exits the EU without approving the withdrawal agreement, and ultimately WTO tariff arrangements will apply to goods trade, there will be non-tariff measures, and services trade will be negatively impacted. In the context of these no-deal scenarios, several studies also consider additional disruptions, particularly in the short run, in terms of exchange rate fluctuations, learning costs, additional disruptions to supply chains, and so on. So the ESRI macro level analysis focuses on the most well-understood channels through which Brexit will impact Ireland, namely through lower trade, incorporating the impact of tariff and non-tariff measures, and the potentially positive impact of FDI diversion to Ireland. We draw on a lot of microeconomic evidence to help build our various macroeconomic Brexit scenarios. We find that GDP, the level of output in Ireland, in the longer term could be over 2.5% lower in a deal scenario and around 5% lower in a no-deal scenario compared to a situation where the UK stays in the EU. This implies a slower pace of growth with negative consequences throughout the economy. Our results indicate that employment in the long run will be just under 2% lower in a deal scenario and over 3% lower in a no-deal scenario. So after about 10 years or so, this represents around 40,000 fewer jobs in the long run in a deal scenario and around 80,000 fewer jobs created in the long run in a no-deal scenario. So it's important to state that GDP and employment will continue to grow in Ireland in each Brexit scenario, but at a slower pace than compared to a situation where the UK stays in the EU. The negative trade shock will reduce the demand for Irish exports, and Irish firms will lose competitiveness because of the depreciation in sterling and higher import prices due to the increases in trading costs. This loss of competitiveness in Ireland would lead to some internal adjustment in the economy, and there will be some downward pressure on wages to help restore lost competitiveness. Lower employment, lower wages, and higher import prices would also mean that households will have less disposable income in the long run. As I said earlier in relation to the impact on the UK economy, there is more uncertainty and variability around the short-run impact of Brexit on Ireland, as it depends crucially on how smooth any transition to the future arrangement between the UK and EU is. Our results suggest that by 2020, the level of output in Ireland will be just over around 0.5% lower in the event of a deal scenario and around 2.5% lower in a no-deal scenario, which incorporates some disruption effects, compared to a situation where the UK stays in the EU. However, these are macroeconometric model-based estimates, and it's easy to think of a situation where uncertainty and additional disruptions to trade could lead to growth in the economy in the short run, in the next couple of years, being more severely curtailed. On a positive note, Ireland could benefit from the relocation or diversion of FDI from the UK, which would raise output and employment in Ireland. However, the positive impact of additional FDI is not sufficient to outweigh the negative trade shock associated with Brexit. Although overall our estimates show substantial relative reductions in the level of output in Ireland over the long run, the Irish economy will continue to grow, but at a slower pace as a consequence of Brexit. So if we assume that the Irish economy could grow by an average of around 3% per annum in the long run if the UK stayed in the EU, the impact of Brexit is roughly equivalent to a 0.3 percentage point reduction in the long-run growth rate in a deal scenario and around a 0.6 percentage point reduction in the long-run growth rate in a no-deal scenario. While the overall macro-level impacts are stark, these are whole economy average effects and will mask some really important differences at a sectoral level, across firm types, at a regional level, and across different types of households. For example, the agri-food sector is particularly exposed to Brexit. This sector is very reliant on the UK as an export market, and it is also the sector that faces the highest tariffs in the event of a no-deal Brexit. For example, the effective WTO tariff rate on meat products is around 60%, and it's close to 50% on dairy products. And this sector will also face non-tariff measures such as checks on complying with EU regulations, which can cause delays in moving goods. SMEs are also particularly vulnerable to Brexit. Around 93% of firms who export to the UK are SMEs, and many trade exclusively with the UK. The costs to businesses in terms of additional documentation and so on are largely independent of the quantity or the value of trade, and so for smaller firms who trade in relatively smaller amounts, these costs as a proportion of their sales will be higher than for larger firms. These uneven impacts across sectors and firm types indicate that the border region and rural communities are particularly vulnerable to the negative impact of Brexit. Another area where we could see very uneven impacts is for consumers. Research by my colleagues has shown that the imposition of tariffs or other increases in trading costs could pass through to increase prices for Irish consumers. Their results suggest potential increases in the level of CPI of between 2 to 3%, and that some of the biggest price increases will be for food. These effects are very unevenly distributed across households. Households with lower income levels would face considerably higher percentage increases, as they tend to consume a higher share of products that will be most affected by increases in tariffs and trade costs. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about how prepared Ireland is for Brexit. So the Revenue Commissioners have hired extra customs staff. Dublin Port has invested in preparing new customs checks. There have been various customs advice events and funding schemes for businesses that are likely to be affected, and some legislation has been passed, in particular to ensure cross-border travel. While Brexit is one of the biggest challenges facing the country, it is difficult to prepare for in the sense that we don't know what type of Brexit we're going to face, and we can't say with certainty that the UK will leave the EU at the end of October. However, we must prepare for the worst outcome while hoping for the best. Thank you.